Tonight's talk is demystifying executive function and how to get our kids ready for school. I'm Emily Zanius, co-chair of Herd and Rye this year, along with Sarah Handy. For those of you who are new to our organization, Herd and Rye is a speakers bureau with a very specific mission to educate our community on the issues most relevant to parenting today. Herd and Rye was formed in 2000 with the goal of organizing events for attendees from all communities, designed to share the ups and downs of raising children with camaraderie and humor. Today, we continue to bring distinguished experts in parenting and education for speaker events in Rye and neighboring towns, and now on Zoom. We could not do any of this without the support of our outstanding team and our generous sponsors, many of which are parent organizations at our schools around the community. So thank you all. We are very excited for this year's lineup of talks and cannot wait to hear what the panelists have for us tonight. In a minute, I will turn it over to Tina Steinberg, one of last year's co-chairs, to introduce the panelists. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. When we do open it up to questions and answers, please put your questions in the QA button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. We will be going to the QA area, not the chat, to get the questions. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Herd and Rye website, which a link in the chat is available. For those of you who want to listen again or pass along to friends who could not join tonight. We will also post additional resources provided by tonight's panelists on the Herd and Rye website. With that, I will turn it over to Tina and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. As a past co-chair of Herd and Rye, I'm very excited to kick off the year with our special guests, Dr. Hilary Cooper and Sharon Thomas. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Hilary Cooper, a longtime Herd and Rye member and past co-chair. Dr. Cooper is the founder of Clear Mind Psychology, a new group practice in Westchester specializing in the psychological treatment of children and adolescents. Dr. Cooper works with children, adolescents, young adults, and parents for anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, and adjustment disorders. Tonight, Dr. Cooper will be sharing her knowledge of executive functioning in order to help parents better understand the term by definition, in addition to what it actually encompasses and how it affects students on a day-to-day basis. We're also excited to welcome Sharon Thomas, who joins us as a learning specialist and educational consultant. She is the founder and director of MAIA Education Resource Center, an organization started over 10 years ago to identify and provide timely educational services. As the leader of MAIA, Sharon guides a team of talented teachers with general and special education training. Her organization works with students ranging from K through college, providing one-to-one tutoring, college placement and workshops, executive function coaching, test preparation, and school placement. Sharon comes here this evening to discuss executive functioning, including developmental milestones, areas of weakness and how it relates to behavior, as well as strategies for students who struggle in this area. At the end of these two discussions, we will be providing a Q&A session in which questions can be submitted using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And as Emily had noted earlier, make sure to use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. This event will be recorded and posted on the Herd and Rye website, and we look forward to an insightful conversation, and thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Tina. We've come such a long way. I'm so proud of our Zoom abilities. So I wanted to start tonight by just kind of wondering, like, why now? You know, why are we talking about executive functioning? Why is it important? Why is it such a big deal? And one of the reasons is that the past probably 10 or 20 years, we know so much more about the brain than we ever have before. It's a really exciting time to just be in neuroscience or psychology or any of these education, because we know so much more. The brain imaging and being able to look at the brain while the brain is doing different tasks makes us understand the brain a lot more. That being said, the funny thing about executive functioning is if you ask, 10 people in the field for a definition, you will probably get 10 different answers. So as much as we know a lot, we still have so much to learn. One of the other reasons why it's important and why we wanted to do this talk is because EF, for some reason, has become a huge buzzword in social media and parenting magazines. And there's a lot of misconception. And we wanted to clarify some things because it's just hard enough to be a parent, much less try and understand some big weird word. And on a personal note, the reason why this has become a real passion for me is twofold. Personally, I was probably one of those kids who had some learning challenges and definitely EF functioning challenges. I never knew where my notebooks were. I couldn't find my classroom. And I was even told at a young age that, who knows if she's going to go to college, working, under her capacity. So I really have a lot of empathy for kids. In my practice now, one of the things that pains me the most is that kids are not being diagnosed and their brains are not being understood. And what ends up happening is, I see a kid 18, 19, 20, and instead of them really understanding how their brain works, understanding their strengths and weaknesses and what EF is, they have kind of already internalized that they're lazy and they're stupid and they're never going to achieve. And either they do that or they're wearing a mask and they're trying to pretend like everything is okay. And they end up in, someone's office like mine with a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression and not knowing really who they are. And it's a very, very big impact on a kid's mental health. So that being said, what is executive functioning? Like, what is this all about? So the way I look at it is executive functioning is like the highest order of human brain capacity. It is all those functions that we use to be successful in school, in work, in life. Some people will say that if we don't help our kids develop executive functioning, that, we will have sort of a paucity of citizens to be able to run our whole society. I mean, not to scare us. So they are the skills that are responsible for the capacity to plan ahead, the capacity to make goals, the capacity to meet those goals. They help us develop self-control and follow multi-step directions. They help us stay focused even when we don't really want to be, or even when we're distracted. And they help us manage difficult emotions. And that's an aspect of executive functioning that wasn't really understood before, but is more understood now. So emotional regulation is also really important. So then, how does the brain develop? I'm sure you guys are kind of sick and tired of hearing about the prefrontal cortex. And what does that mean? So I'm going to use I'm not going to talk or anything with my hand puppet or anything, because that would be embarrassing. But, let's say this is the brain. Okay. So here's the brain stem where the spine goes into the brain. This is the most primitive functioning of the brain. So this is the earliest part of the brain that develops. And that's in control of all the basics like breathing and, blood flow and, all the real things that we don't even think about. And so slowly but surely, development kind of happens. This is kind of rudimentary and I'm not a neuropsychologist, so forgive me. But basically, this is basically the frontal cortex. And then inside here, within the middle brain, are places where we develop memory. This is where the amygdala is. So emotions, and so then the prefrontal cortex that we talk so much about. We used to think that was the main kind of area of the brain that is responsible for executive functioning. What we know now, though, is that all of these areas of the brain, every area of the brain, and all the networks that connect all those areas of the brain are actually all working together. it's not one area of the brain or versus another. We used to think that it was all about the prefrontal cortex. What we really think, how we think about executive functioning is that the prefrontal cortex is like the air traffic controller. So, managing all the routes and the airplanes and everybody coming in and out. I think about it as like the main engineer of the New York City subway system. That's how I think about it, and all the major connections and everything. And if you miss your stop, like forget it, you're all the way over, in Queens when you wanted to be in Manhattan. And sort of that is how I think about executive functioning and how things can get lost in the brain, especially for our kids. So I hope that's helpful. So just carrying that New York City subway thing a little farther, because I like imagery. With our kids, the signals can get crossed. So you could think that you said one thing and the kid didn't hear that thing. That's kind of like the engineer, just like somehow the messaging didn't get through. I think sometimes kids can miss their stop. Literally, the message stops and then doesn't really go further to the prefrontal cortex. That might happen when you ask your kid to do 3 different things and maybe they do like half of one. Sometimes the tracks aren't finished, which I think, Sharon will kind of talk about, is like, how do we finish our kids' tracks? Like sometimes it's just not developed yet. And then the other important thing is that we develop executive functioning in the context of our environment. We have to also learn them in the context of an important environment. So environment, I mean, definitely rules and, our spaces are clean and all that kind of stuff, and organized, and we know what time we have to get to school and all that kind of stuff. But I also mean the emotional environment. So when I think of debris on the tracks that make it really hard for a kid to develop executive functioning, I think of anxiety, I think of worries, I think of chaos, and all of those things, in our brain can kind of bathe our brain in debris that doesn't allow executive functioning to, flow as easily as we wish it would. And speaking of debris, I just want to also kind of just a caveat is, our kids have been developing the past 2 years in the context of COVID. So I want to give ourselves a break as parents. I want to give our kids a break, because when you're developing, doesn't matter really what brain skills, but especially these executive functioning skills, when you're developing in the context of stress, there's like good stress and then there's toxic stress. And I would say COVID kind of represented toxic stress for a lot of us, and certainly a lot of our kids. And, our teachers, everybody did such an amazing job to facilitate learning under these really hard circumstances. And yet, there's sometimes only so much you can do, because certain kids are going to need more help than others. So I just also want to kind of remind ourselves that we've been expecting our kids to kind of literally stay on track. And, we might be a little delayed, we might be a little, off center, and please try not to worry, but also give your kids a little bit of a break, and yourselves as well. Another caveat regarding executive functioning relates to ADHD. A lot of the kids that I see have been diagnosed with ADHD. And so like, what's the difference? Basically, you can have executive functioning challenges and not have ADHD, but every person who has ADHD, every person has executive functioning skills. So again, every person diagnosed with ADHD, and hopefully you have a good diagnosis and a good assessment, but every kid with ADHD has executive functioning challenges. So yeah, I hope that's helpful too. But it can be really super confusing to parents, because even our ADHD kids have major strengths in some areas. Maybe they once they start a task, they totally finish it. But do they have a hard time initiating it? So maybe they have a hard time with initiation, but not completion. What other examples? I think I hear more often from parents, well, why can they focus so long on a video game and they can't do their homework or they can't do the dishes? Well, executive functioning, like the tracks on a train, it needs energy to develop. And if we're really motivated to do something and we think we're good at it and it doesn't give us stress because no one told us we were bad at it, then we are going to have a lot of energy and be able to focus on that thing because it also comes easily to us. So it doesn't mean that your kid's lazy. Executive functioning isn't laziness. It isn't being dumb. It isn't being willful. I don't know any kid in my practice who wants to be seen as lazy. I don't know any kid in my practice who actually wants to disagree with their parents. They don't, but their brains sometimes just are lagging behind, or, there's some strengths in some areas and weaknesses in other. Okay, so another basic about executive functioning is we are all born with the capacity to learn executive function skills, but we are not actually born with the skills themselves. So executive functioning skills are, we have the capacity and we start learning them from the age, from the moment we're born, really. How to regulate our emotions and what to expect. And, even little babies kind of like learn that. And we know that between the ages of 3 and 5, there's a very big jump in executive functioning. I don't think we know why, but, expect a big jump in executive functioning skills. And I'll go over what those skills are between the ages of 3 and 5. And then after that jump, we kind of plateau in our development. And then we have a little bit more of a bump in our late 20s and 30s, which is really interesting. And then as we age, unfortunately, mid 50s, we see a little bit of a lag, which is very disappointing to me, but I get it. Because I can't remember why I walked in the room half the time. So, and that's an executive functioning skill. So environment is really important. And we all contribute to that. Teachers, friends, parents, everybody contributes to the environment. The really important thing to know is also we learn executive functioning skills in the context of our environment. So there are I counted over 50 apps that claim to help develop executive functioning. There are books. There's, websites, and some are fabulous. And I have no problem with a kid doing an app if they enjoy it. However, that's not necessarily going to be able to be, those skills that they develop on an app or a game are not really shown to actually develop in their real life. So they don't really take those skills and generalize them to real life. So they might be fun and hey, better than some other things, but they're probably not necessarily helping your kid with executive functioning on a daily basis, because we have to learn them in the context of school. We have to learn them in the context of home. So that's an important point. Let's see. So I already went over that. So what is executive function? What are we talking about? So as I've said, there are many definitions, there are many different models. A couple of things that most researchers agree upon, and Sharon might also have some more definitions as well. Most people agree that there are 3 major areas of functioning responsible for executive functioning. Okay, so 3 big areas, and then kind of broken down into little skills. So the first that everybody agrees upon is working memory. So, what is working memory? Working memory is, having access to something that you remember, something that you learned quickly, and being able to use it in a real life situation, or use it to make connections in a real life situation. So, this is, what we use when you run into that person you really you hadn't seen in a long time, and you're stumbling for the word, and finally you figure out what her name is. For our kids, what does that look like? I think social studies is really hard when you're working memory is not great. I think I think that DBQ essays that a lot of kids do can really be challenging when you don't have working memory. I think answering questions in class and being called on, cold called, I can't really imagine doing that, but that would be very hard if you had working memory. I think also remembering multi-step functions. So again, like multiple steps in what you're asking kids to do. So working memory is really, really important. Inhibitory control is the second thing. So inhibitory control is, everybody talks about the marshmallow study. So marshmallow study is, I don't know how many years ago, we always talked about this study, but it's really indicative of how kids can manage their, control their behavior. So in the study, there are kids in preschool who are given one marshmallow. And then they're told, but if you wait, you can get 2 marshmallows. So kids who have strong inhibitory control, they put aside the impulse to eat that marshmallow because they know that if they wait, they can get 2. So those kinds of skills really follow us throughout our life. It all inhibitory control also allows us to kind of filter out information and distractions that aren't helpful. It helps our kids not get distracted by the other kid tapping his pencil during a during class. It also helps us, bite our tongue when we don't want to say something nice. So inhibitory control is the second major group of functioning. The third would be cognitive or mental flexibility. So, we want kids to be really focused, but we also want them to have the capacity to be flexible. And so cognitive and mental flexibility is really important. Think of that like when a kid plays Uno. When they play Uno, sometimes they have to match things by number and then switch and match it by by colors. So that's kind of cognitive flexibility. It allows people to kind of shift gears. If something's not working, they don't sort of just keep staying on the same task. They will switch gears. So cognitive flexibility, super, super important. Let's see, I apologize for. So let me describe a day when executive functioning was working really well. So a couple of Sundays ago, I was really proud of myself. I ordered food ahead of time, had it delivered. Next day, I woke up exactly the time I wanted to. I walked the dog at exactly the time I wanted to, put food in the slow cooker. Really proud of myself for putting all the food away so I knew where they were. Then drove my kid to school, stopped at CVS, waited on that line, even though people were asking a ton of different questions. I somehow stayed centered, left with my prescription, went on to work, started to work, took a break, got a text from my daughter, kind of cryptic. Mom, I have a piercing appointment tomorrow, ... Okay, manage my emotions enough to just respond, hopefully the ear, right? Question mark, question mark. So then I managed my emotions, calmed myself down, saw my next patient, and somehow managed to remember her best friend's name. And the day went on. Now, that is a unicorn day. That rarely ever happens. But I used almost every executive functioning that you can imagine. I planned and prioritized. I put away the groceries. I ordered the right ones. Super proud of myself. These are executive functioning, okay? Emotional regulation. Somehow I managed my emotions well enough to go back and focus on work when my daughter said something about the piercing. It's all good now, it's fine. Anyway, I sustained my attention. So despite worrying or wondering about, my daughter, I was somehow able to kind of put that somewhere else and stay focused. Not easy to do. I organized myself and my materials because I put everything away. My working memory was pretty good. I remembered someone's best friend's name. Very proud of myself. Another skill that I used was metacognition, which is really important, I feel, for our kids. Is I don't know if I actually use this, but I think metacognition is important in that you know how your brain works. So I know my deficits, I know my strengths, and I'm able to kind of act accordingly. The other thing that's important about metacognition for our kids is it allows us to have empathy and to like put ourselves in another person's shoes. Other skills included in executive functioning are cognitive flexibility. Not sure this is a great example, but Uno is a great example for kids. Self-monitoring. So, a child who waits her turn at the water fountain and, doesn't cut in line because she's thirsty. So within the major categories of executive functions are the other kind of smaller behaviors, self-monitoring and cognitive flexibility and working memory is a big one throughout. So that's kind of how it looks. Now, usually I got to be honest, usually on a Monday, it goes absolutely nothing like that. And my executive functioning totally goes out the window. Can't find the car keys. Groceries came at the wrong time, sitting in the sun as I dropped my kid off at school, so frazzled by the long line, at the car line that I put my car in neutral and rev it a couple of times, kind of embarrassed myself. Don't wait online at CVS because I can't handle it. And I feel like Will Ferrell and kicking and screaming. So like, I'm not perfect. So the important thing is that we all have executive functioning challenges, all of us. But unlike our kids, we're not graded. We're on those. And we tend to do things that we like doing. So our kids don't have that, luxury. And that's why it's a challenge for them. They have to stay in school. They have to do things that are not in their wheelhouse. They have to pay attention and, stay still. They have to remember what's going in their book bag. But we all have executive function glitches, all of us. Yeah. So how do we help our kids? Sharon is going to speak a little bit more about interventions and red flags and when to get help and all that. We have some references. We have some on the Heard and Rye website, on my website, that might be really helpful. There are a lot of parenting books. Some people talk or write about if you're going to parent a child with executive functioning or ADHD challenges, parenting with the 5 C's. There's a lot of talk about scaffolding. And what scaffolding means is when the kids are little, it's sort of like developing the foundation of a building. When you're developing the foundation of a building, you have a scaffold to kind of guide it up. So when they're little, you have rules and, you have predictability and you have routines, and that's all building the building. And then as the child gets older, you're kind of taking that away. You don't need to model so much for them. You don't need to remind them of rules all the time. And as they get older, you want to take the scaffolding and the guide, not necessarily guidance, stay guided, stay as a guide to your kid, stay focused, but you don't need to intervene so much. Now, kids with ADHD and executive functioning challenges, you have to be helpful, and we found until college age. So I will hand it off to Sharon now because she's a wonderful expert on what to do and when to do it. And thank you.
So
Here you go.
Thank you, Hilary, for putting that level of trust in me. As you mentioned, none of us are perfect with our executive function skills. And I think the idea of this talk is both to give solid information about what to expect at different stages when we're talking about K through 12, and also what are some things that can be done when there's some trickiness there in relation to executive function development. So I came to this story over 10 years ago of looking at executive function as a field because I worked in the field of education. I worked in schools and I still do. as a matter of fact, alongside from running my organization, my Education Resource Center. But as I was working with students academically, I really noticed that there were so many smart students that we often would scratch our heads about and wonder, why are they underperforming? So that really began an inquiry for me as to what was it? What were the foundational skills that were missing for these students who were clearly very articulate, who seemed very interested when it was a topic that they enjoyed, who had incredible background knowledge, who often were extraordinarily creative and funny, and could think outside of the box. And yet when it came to doing what I call the easy stuff that's hard to do, such as working on a paper and then taking that next step and handing it in, that wasn't happening. And so that's where the underperforming piece came in. So I started to really pay attention to this, and I went to listen to the greats in the field of executive function, Bartlett being one of them. He's one of the top researchers in the field. And I went to many conferences to hear what people had to say, and eventually was a presenter at conferences. And one of the things that I think we can agree on is that students who struggle with executive function skills typically, if not always, underperform. So they're most definitely not reaching their top, their optimal self when the pieces aren't coming together for them that, you know, are the basis of learning. So attention being one of them, right? We can't really learn anything if we're not attending to it. So when we're looking at K through 12 and what to expect there, I think of it in chunks of time. I think of elementary school years, I think of middle school years, and I think of high school years. And I think about the developmental milestones that we want to see in each of these different divisions, so to speak, of the K through 12 system. So when we're talking about elementary school students, we want to see that students are internalizing classroom routines. We want to see that they're able to follow verbal instructions, directions, and later written directions. They're able to read those directions. They're able to hold the sequence in memory. They're able to follow through in that sequence. They're able to hold bits of information in memory. And they're able to use that information in somewhat of a flexible way. Elementary school students, even in the earlier years, are expected to keep track of their things, such as their book bag or their lunchbox, things that become part of the routine. They're expected to do this eventually automatically without having to have lots of prompts from a teacher or having to be reminded by parents, you know, to follow through. Self-awareness starts developing in elementary school years. Students start to notice, what is it that I'm capable of doing and not capable of doing? Self-regulation being extremely important to learning. So in elementary school years, we want to see that students are increasing their ability to handle frustration and become less impulsive when they feel like there's a roadblock towards something that they want to do. We want to see that they're able to stay, that they're able to attend to a task for longer periods of time. And we want to see that students are gaining ground in their basic skills of reading, writing, and math. And one of the pieces that's very interesting to me about students who struggle with executive function skills is that often we will see a skill gap in one or more of the academic skills area of reading, writing, and math. Not necessarily because there's a learning disability at play, but because there hasn't been the level of practice that students need to have in order to master those skills. And that's extremely important to look at, because as students then transition into middle school years, the executive function skill deficits that they have will become much more visible. In the middle school years, as we know, students are no longer in their cozy homeroom setting. They're expected to have teachers coming from different departments, and they're expected to be able to learn how to respond to different teachers and their expectations and their personalities. They're expected to shift and move around a building, often between classes, and they're expected to be able to take materials that they need from class to class. the focus really starts to shift from the learning of the skills to using the skills to learn. And so particularly for the students who missed out earlier on in that practicing of skills, this can become a double whammy in which they are both struggling with the skill of staying organized with their materials, staying organized with their thoughts when they're putting ideas down on paper, and also doing sometimes a catch up with basic skills. So one of the pieces that's important to the middle school years, of course, is the social development that students are expected to have. And reading the shades of gray becomes even more, much more part of the social expectation. So students who struggle with executive function skills often struggle with controlling their impulses, often struggle with sustaining their attention, and often struggle with being able to read the nuances throughout the day, and often don't know why other students and other teachers are responding to them in a way that feels negative. So the demands in middle school years for greater time management and organization and planning, prioritizing, keeping track of one's life increases substantially right smack at the same time that there are fluctuating hormones that may cause the ups and downs in moods. So, there's often conversations surrounding the fact that there are expectations of middle school students that don't necessarily match where they are with what they have to manage hormonally. And that is something for us to be mindful of, because if you do see fluctuations in your youngster, if you do see a youngster that one day seems to be able to manage his or her life, and then the next day, that doesn't seem to be happening, that could also be attributed to hormonally what may be going on. So as we progress in school years and we look at high school students, as we know, there are higher expectations of independence. There's a lot of conversations about students who struggle to keep track of their lives, keep track of their assignments, keep track, understand what teachers' expectations are of them. And there's a lot of conversations often that happen surrounding that student that go something like this. He, she, or they should be able to do this. They are a freshman, they are a sophomore, they are a junior, they are a senior. They're going to eventually go to college. They have to be able to do this. And it's clear that we want students at the high school level to be managing their assignments, to be managing their time. They tend to have more extracurricular activities after school. And so therefore time management becomes even more important. They have to be able to continue to read the shades of gray, and it becomes more sophisticated in what they have to read in a nuanced way and at the speed in which they need to do so. They need to also learn how to manage stress. Test taking being an area that for students is really important to master that stress surrounding tests. They need to be completing assignments within a given amount of time. And so often what happens with high school students where the expectation is of increased independence is that if the conversation stays stuck with, well, this is what the expectation is, and he, she, they are not following through, then they will continue to stay stuck. Because I am a firm believer, after over 20 years of working with youngsters, that if students can do something, they will. Students don't want to be struggling with executive function skills. They don't want to willfully not be able to complete an assignment on time. Even if they have this bravado of, well, I don't care, yes, I got this grade, but I don't care, that's just fine. That's really often not the case. It's often the case that I will see that there is a great deal actually of pain surrounding the struggles with executive function skills. And so that there's a mask and a face put on about seemingly not caring, when in fact there can be shame surrounding it. So as a parent, what we can do to support our youngsters is to look for patterns. And often when parents come to speak with me and we start to discuss what the patterns are and were earlier on, there's a level of predictability there. There's a level of sort of a narrative of that student that goes back far into, sometimes elementary school years. And so when the executive function deficits become visible, often it's been years in that students have been struggling mightily. And what can happen in the earlier years is that parents, very well-meaning, and educators who are well-meaning and caretakers who are well-meaning might just be putting so much energy into supporting that student that it becomes doing for the student. So the elementary school years, it may be, the student never manages to have the backpack going out the door. And so in order to get the kiddo off to school, right, the natural behavior could be a parent just packing that backpack and holding onto that backpack and taking it to school. In the middle school years, we could have a student who always or tends to most of the time forget materials at school or forgets to hand in work on time. And you might see a parent, flying down the FDR here in Manhattan to get that assignment in on time so that the student isn't penalized. At the high school level, we might see, parents in trying to help a student, putting in a lot of the academic support at the 11th hour as the student has dug him or herself or they into a hole and really needs to complete now 10 assignments within a period of a week. So then, there can be this plan of, okay, well, let's just put all the resources in to make sure that there isn't failure at the end of this. And this is all extremely well-meaning because no parent, I believe, wants to see their child fail, and no parent, I believe, wants to see their child suffer. And I think that there are even, very well-meaning educators who end up doing more for certain students because they care and they want, they see the potential, they see that students can do certain, can think at a sophisticated level, but somehow it's not translating to the work. And so there can be a lot of leniency there, which doesn't necessarily help a student, because what helps students is to experience support that is scaffolded. As Hilary mentioned, scaffolding is doing things bit by bit, taking, let's say, a big assignment and breaking it down, and then helping the student focus on one thing at a time and helping a student work from start to completion. So for students to learn the strategies bit by bit is really important. And for them to also periodically have clear consequences is also really important, because we don't want to see college students not being able to manage their lives. And unfortunately, in our society right now, we're seeing many college students who suffer with the executive function struggles not be able to keep up in college. So as early as we can catch it, we want to catch it. And we want to make sure that we're giving the students strategies in a way that meets them where they are at. So when we're talking about how to support a student who's clearly struggling, who is underperforming, who isn't ever on time, who just seemingly seems disconnected, disengaged, when in fact it's just that they are not living in real time. They're not doing things in real time and always feeling behind the train, running behind that train. So what we want to do there is to figure out, what is the pattern? What is it that is standing in the way from the student's ability to complete the work, to live life in a sequential way, to follow through on plans? What is it that stands in the way there? And we want to be mindful to have 2 or 3 goals as to how we're going to help that student. Most executive function plans fail because there are way too many goals. There's a laundry list of everything a student can't do. And they may even start off feeling motivated to learn the strategies, but eventually that motivation will fade away because there are too many things that they're trying to change all at once. So when we're looking at, let's say, time management, we're looking at things like, well, how does a student keep track of time? Where is the visual? Out of sight, out of mind, right, is the saying. So how do we create visuals for a student so that, it's clear, here's where your life is, and it's your entire life. It's not just that you have assignments coming in on a portal, a school portal, and that's how you base all of your tracking of your life. And that is happening a lot for students, where they will use one tool to track their lives, but that tool doesn't really give them access to putting everything in there. So teaching students very specifically, this is how you're going to keep track of everything you need to do in your life. And that includes not just your assignments, not just your extracurricular activities, but also that birthday party, also your downtime. You need that downtime. And often students who struggle with time management don't give themselves breaks. And so what tends to happen is that they will say, I'm going to work straight for 6 hours, which is not reasonable. And then at some point they'll take a break in there, and that break that was supposed to last maybe for 5 to 10 to 15 minutes can last for hours. So, really helping a student see their time and helping them think through in the metacognitive way of the thinking about their thinking, what is it that they need? And how is it that they're going to get what they need, which includes not just the focus on the tasks from start to completion, but also in terms of how are they going to give themselves downtime, and to be able to sustain all of this. So we want to be, as much as we can be, patient. And I know that that's really difficult to do, especially with a child who has many difficulties in this area, because what can happen is that adults can feel as if they're that child's brain, literally, having to give the constant reminders, having to take care of the materials, having to do a lot for that youngster, and that can be extraordinarily frustrating. But to remind oneself, if this youngster could do it, he, she, or they would do it. And therefore, let's think at why are these issues coming up? What is it? Why is the struggle here? Identifying the issue as a team is really helpful and important. So as a parent, you should never feel alone with, here's a problem and it's all on me to figure out what's going on. It takes a village to raise a child. I really believe that. And so, tapping into the resources of a school as concerns start to come up, to really address it directly with the teacher, to say, this is what I'm noticing at home. Are you noticing this at school too? And from there, if there is a consensus, and it could be, a conversation with the classroom teacher, in addition to a school counselor, in addition to a learning specialist at school. So, really looking at how, as a team, are we looking at this student, and how are we going to collaborate in working with the student? And that's also extremely important with kids with executive function difficulties. They need really good integration of services. They need adults who are consistent. So if they are working on specific goals for time management, specific goals for planning and prioritizing, specific goals to control their impulses, it's really important that all the adults who are supporting this youngster K through 12, no matter what age this is happening at, that there be communication, really strong communication between people who are looking at this, so that the approach is consistent. What is being said to the youngster is consistent. The tools that the youngster is using should be consistent. So there shouldn't be 5 different calendars and 5 different ways to track one's life, right? It has to be consolidated into one, and everybody working with that youngster needs to know this is how we do it. And that's extremely important. The homeschool relationship can't be underscored enough. It is really the outcome of how a youngster will come to acquire these skills, maybe in a delayed way, but still acquire these skills, really depends often on this homeschool relationship. And so what tends to happen, of course, is that when students are in elementary school years, it's natural that there be more of that partnership and more of that communication with teachers. Once they move into middle school and high school and it becomes more departmentalized, it gets trickier because there are more adults involved, and the adults may come at it from different perspectives, different trainings. And so really at the beginning of the year, it's important that parents see it as a fresh year, and that is a fresh conversation about the student, what are the needs, how as a team is this going to be dealt with, and what are going to, how will the student be supported throughout the year, but also what are the touch points? How will people communicate to make sure that things don't become about the 11th hour? It doesn't become, oh, by the way, your child hasn't handed in 15 assignments. And that's okay, because during winter break, we're going to give your child a chance to catch up, right? That's never ideal, and it actually doesn't teach great things for a kid. So we want to be proactive. We want to get in there and already at the very beginning of the school year, think through, here are some of the challenges and let's talk about them. Students need to be enlisted in what the goals are. So whenever I work with a student who needs executive function support, the first thing I want to see is what is their level of awareness of what their struggles are. Because if they are not engaging, then we're not going to get anywhere. And it could very well be that I have a student who walks in my door and says, oh, I don't care, I don't really want to work on this, I don't see what the problem is. And with more conversations, we can often get to the root of why that behavior is there. And as I mentioned before, it could be coming from a place of shame. Students know what they're supposed to be doing. They are looking around. They are seeing what their peers are able to do. And if they're not able to do the same things, it doesn't feel good. So one of the benefits of working together as a parent with a professional is that as students age, they really don't want to often, if not most of the time, they'll push back if they have to work with a parent. They don't want that relationship to be about teacher-student. So having professionals involved, especially as students age, is really important, because it is common that students will be oppositional even with a parent. No matter how well-meaning a parent is, no matter how great a parent is with executive function skills and can teach it to their kid, it can really go south quickly. If it's not working, then again, it's really important to enlist others, in partnering and looking at this and how to support the student. So one of the pieces that I will often look at is what are certain routines that a student has that may have functioned somewhat for them in a dysfunctional way. So they may, for instance, keep track of some of their lives by writing information on their hand or on little bits of pieces of paper or on sticky notes. And it has worked for them up to a certain point, and then it doesn't work for them. And looking at what students are doing, and then when we are looking at changing some of those routines, we have to keep in mind that the strategies and the skills are easy to teach, and they don't take a long time to teach, but the habits are hard to break. And so when parents ask, well, my child's going to start working with a specialist who understands executive function coaching, how long should this take? Typically, again, it's really about looking at the routines and placing a student in a different routine than they've had. Depending on their age, they may have practiced certain routines, even if they were dysfunctional, for many years. And so it's going to take time for new routines to become internalized and become just part of how a student does things. And I would say that a full academic year is a reasonable time frame to look at in terms of the work and in terms of changes that are consistent, that we can consistently see, my student has gained here, my child has gained more independence with this, but we want to make sure that there's a lot of practice so that the over practice creates the routines and makes the routines just part of a student's life. If we remove the supports too quickly, what we'll find is that there is a regression to the old habits, because old habits are still automatic for that student. So as we think about our students, once again, I have a great deal, first of all, of affection for students who struggle with executive function skills. I often see just how bright they are and how interesting and funny, and also how difficult life truly is for them. And as much as possible, even if I have a student beyond high school years coming to me, relaying really painful stories about just not being able to follow through on things that should be basic. It again reinforces the idea that, if individuals could do it, they would. And so, trying to avoid the phrase of, this child's this age, this is something that they should just be able to do. They're not going to just be able to do it. They are going to need the help. They're going to need somebody who really breaks things down and who practices with them. And part of the practice on the basic skills can feel embarrassing. So that connection with a professional is really important. That trust, building that trust is really important. There are many resources for families, for parents who have children who need support in this area. I developed an executive function skill guide to explain to parents what the work of executive function coaching can look like, and what are the areas that we're looking at for a student. How do we identify, what we should be looking at, and how we should be approaching it. Is all part of what got written up in this executive function skill guide, and it is going to be shared tonight with you, and so you can access it for free. I am very excited about the idea that we just know so much more, and we do have so much more resources, and that we are thinking about this in a very different way than we thought about this 10, 15 years ago, and that we're catching students earlier and earlier who are benefiting from, really getting the interventions. And so if you as a parent or a professional are sensing that, something just is not developing in the way that it should, that there's something not comfortable, even if it's a gut feeling, never hesitate to speak up. Even if you may not be correct, that there's something wrong, it's really important to point it out when we see it, because as much as early as we can to intervene will have a tremendously positive impact on our kids. So at this point, I thank you for having me join you, and I am open to answering questions.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. That was incredible in many respects. So much helpful information for all of us. So thank you. It's definitely a topic that I can relate to as well, both personally and professionally. And I feel like it's turned into such a catchphrase, but when you really start to understand what's actually involved in these skills, then you can better understand how to support your children. So I think that these resources, these definitions, and this broader understanding of the term will really help parents advocate for their kids and work with their kids to strengthen these skills. So we do have a bunch of questions coming in, and you can continue to add them at the bottom of the screen in the Q&A function. So one of the questions that has come up a few times is figuring out that balance of how do we help our children learn and stay on top of everything and work responsibly, but at the same time fostering their independence and knowing how or when not to cross that line. You know, that's a really tough call for parents. So what would your suggestions be for navigating that idea?
Sharon, you want to start?
So I want to better understand the question. So if you could just repeat that question, that would help me.
Sure. So basically just like there's a fine line between helping too much, helping too little, and just sort of navigating what that should look like. So, I mean, I've experienced this myself as a parent. You know, you feel like if you don't help and you don't support and you feel like you're doing such a great job supporting them, but how do you know when to pull back and still help them develop that independence?
Right.
How do we gauge that?
Sure. And I think that is something that comes up all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's a little bit like a spotting of a gymnast, right? We want to be there and we want to make sure that there's the hand, and that if, you know, the child's going to fall, the hand is there and we're going to spot and not allow for the crash, right? And I do think that, you know, in more practical terms, it's about enlisting others in supporting this independence, right? So it may be that there's a conversation with the teacher about, you know, here's the task that needs to get done, and the task involves 10 steps. And so maybe the expectation is that the child will be responsible for 2 of those steps out of the 10 steps, right? And that we are gradually working towards the child being able to do the 10 steps. But where things often get complicated is that it can become an all or nothing, right? I'm going to support you a lot. I'm going to give you everything. Or you know what? I am so fed up with you now. You do it on your own, right? And there can be, I'm a parent of a teenager, and, you know, a teenager who does have her own executive function pieces. And, you know, I appreciate just how frustrating it can get, particularly because depending on the child's temperament, depending on their age, they can push back. One minute they want our support, then they don't want our support. You know, so figuring that dance out is nuanced. And, you know, I don't think that there's an exact answer here, but rather, you know, it is about thinking about, you know, what does this task involve? Exactly how many steps, right? And what within that can I reasonably expect? And really setting kids up for success is so important. So we want to give them tasks that they can do, right? That they are able to reach. Even if we're challenging them, right? They're going to be able to do this, right? And then that builds on itself.
I would also say, really know your kids' strengths and weaknesses. And if it's hard, if that information, it's really hard to assess as a parent, but you might be sort of like overdoing it in some area. And maybe that's not actually your kid's weakness. So, you know, there are a lot of ways and a lot of feedback from a lot of people in your child's life. And there are actual really good assessments now about strengths, different executive functioning skills. So I think it's really important to know, well, where are his strengths, where is his weaknesses? Because you don't want to overdo it if that's actually not your child's weakness. And I think, you know, the quote unquote 5 C's of parenting can be helpful, but as Sharon stated, it's almost more of an art than an actual, you know, step-by-step thing, which makes parenting just so hard. But the 5 C's, which can be helpful, are self-control. So work on your own control. So, you manage your emotions, as Sharon said. Try not to do it in the context of judging your kid or judging yourself for your kid not being at a certain level. Compassion. So compassion for yourself too, and putting yourself in that kid's shoes. Sometimes when I think about, well, what's a day like for these kids? And I'm sure Sharon, like if you run through your kid's day, you'll develop some compassion for them, because I don't have to switch bosses every period, collaboration, as Sharon said, consistency, and celebrate. We forget about this piece, but it is so important for the brain that, as Sharon said, when everything is broken down into manageable pieces, you're more likely to be able to celebrate those little wins. And the brain is more likely to do those things when the child feels rewarded. So not an actual answer to your question, but I think just an overall sort of framework.
Yeah, and that actually leads into the next question, which I think you kind of covered, and especially with that idea of the 5 C's of parenting, that, what would you even recommend to parents in the heat of the moment, especially for younger kids, when they've repeated it 100 times, what to do, get out of the house, the clock is running, everyone's screaming, self-control for parents is almost impossible.
It's almost impossible. And I would say obviously pick your battles. And if your kid goes to school without a jacket, fine, let them be cold. There are natural consequences to whatever your kid forgets. And I would rather that kid know at a little age that at a young age, no one's going to bail you out. And if you make certain choices, it's your body, it's the choices you're making. So, majorly pick your battles. I feel like if you have to say something more than 2 times, that kid is not hearing it anymore at all. So, figure out either another way to say it, or, just get them in the car somehow. Or, if someone else is at home, leave. I mean, I hate to say it, I don't want to be cavalier, but there are natural consequences, like being cold. It's really, really hard. And also we tend to notice what's going wrong, the one kid who's not getting in the car, and you never want to compare one kid to another and say, look at your sister, she's doing that. But you can say, oh my gosh, I love the way Susie got in the car. I'm so proud of you. And when, Sharon gets in the car, sorry, Sharon, when, Sharon gets in the car, I'm gonna be so proud of her too. But our brains don't go there. Our brains go to the kid who's messing up, quote unquote, messing up. Not really, if their brains don't work, in an organized fashion, but, go towards noticing what is going right too. Harder, very hard to do, but is really helpful overall.
That's good advice. Okay, shifting gears a little bit in terms of executive functioning and school. So what does executive functioning weaknesses, concerns, what does that look like on an IEP necessarily? And how do parents advocate for the kids at these meetings, get the supports, the accommodations, the services? What do those look like in a school setting? And could they be on the IEP? That's a lot in one.
Right. So usually in an IEP, what's being looked at are the academic skills, right? And just is this child meeting, the standards expected for that grade level? And so again, we know that there are children who are not meeting those standards because they have executive function weaknesses. And so, what are you asking for really depends on your child's age, right? That's going to change dramatically, possibly from, elementary, middle, and high school. Some things may stay the same. But what we want to look at are what kinds of supports does this child need in school in order to be able to meet the standards, right? And those supports may include having a teacher who's giving more prompts to the child if the child's young and struggling to pay attention. It may include extra time on a test. It may include computer use, depending on the child's age. That's a very hard question to answer because it's very much case dependent. And I appreciate where the question's coming from, right? Because we as parents want to go into these meetings very prepared. In New York City, at least, a parent can request an advocate, and there's no fee for this advocate to come into an IEP meeting. And that is a person who really is an ally, right? And can look at, here are the struggles, here's what we need to ask in order for, this child to have an optimal year. I would not as a parent just go in cold. I would turn to somebody who can really break it down.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure, Sharon, you've been to IEPs. I go to IEPs all the time, meetings. But I do feel for districts, because I think the accommodations haven't really caught up to where the research is yet. So it's kind of hard, as the parent who asked this question is reminding us, it's kind of hard to, what's the word, like systematize in the classroom what executive functioning deficits look like. I'm just reminded of one thing that we often ask for, which is, repeating directions, like, verbal directions, multiple cues, verbal and written. And as Sharon mentioned, it depends on your kid's age and their particular strengths and weaknesses. And it really depends on the district, so, but always go in with somebody, some help, and someone who knows the system and can help you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is very good advice. It is overwhelming, and the terms are overwhelming, and it's emotional as well. So that's always a good idea. And even just interestingly, what I'm even learning from both of you is just how to differentiate those executive functioning skills from learning disabilities and ADHD. And that distinction, I think, is so important. And it really, you've highlighted, for me at least, how much how different the intervention looks, because with academic interventions, it's more of a direct instruction, but yet it seems like with executive functioning, the student plays a very different role, in planning and goals and all of that. So it's much more of a team effort with student and teacher or coach, as opposed to necessarily an academic intervention. So it's really hard to tease those apart, but definitely related.
Right. And often you'll see that students need both. They need the academic intervention, and, in terms of addressing their basic skills, right? And the executive function intervention. And as much as possible, if there can be one person who can address both, right? That's ideal. Consolidating for students and their lives and making it simple is ideal, because once you start to add a lot of professionals to the picture, right? The communication becomes true.
It also allows for kids to learn in the context of what they're already studying. So if you have the same person doing executive functioning and maybe helping with certain subjects, do you find, Sharon, or like, certain assignments, then the kids learning the skills in the context of what they already have to do. And that, that's really, really helpful.
Right. No, I agree.
Another idea here, another question is that you mentioned students and children knowing about their own deficits and weaknesses and advocating for themselves, but also understanding it. So what should they know about their executive functioning skills, and how do you explain this to them? At what age, how does it differ at different age levels? And, how do you explain this to kids?
Right. So students are really fascinated by conversations regarding the brain. Mm-hmm. And it's never too early to start. I mean, it's about making it appropriate, right? And the language needs to be appropriate. And obviously for the little ones, we want to keep it very simple and, highly visual. And for older students, you can go into more detail. But I think for them to understand, oh, I'm smart, and this is just something that is happening because of how this particular thing, is functioning in my brain. I find that students actually grasp quite a bit. They understand that they are struggling, first of all, and then once they understand here's why, right, it's a huge relief. To know that somebody will step in and help, because again, as I mentioned, at students' age, there can be a lot of shame. surrounding not having certain skills, right?
Yeah.
So I once taught a workshop for teachers in a highly academic setting where I titled the workshop, "It's the easy stuff that's hard to do." And I went through brain development and it, sort of step by step with teachers as to why certain things were difficult for students, right? That it wasn't actually oppositional behavior.
No. I think that it goes back to assessment also, and just like knowing your kid. I mean, it's not foolproof, but like for instance, if your kid has had a good neuropsych, ask the person who's done some of the evaluations, like how might you explain this to my child? Some really great neuropsychologists will actually meet with the child in a really age appropriate way. I think it's important not to use stigmatizing words, like not to use like disability. You use challenge. You're very specific, like your brain is great at this and not so good at this, so we got to like work on this. There are some in the reference guide, the references that I put together. There's also like some children's books that are great about the brain. And I think just make it a part of your conversation. Your muscles are really good at this, but not so good at this. Your brain's really great at, organizing all of your Legos. And sometimes you have a really hard time starting homework. So just kind of be very specific about what you're noticing, so they also know what you guys are trying to work on. I rather, what Sharon's been saying, and from a clinical psychologist standpoint, and Sharon, I think, said it well, is I would rather a child know their brain rather than either wear a mask that, I'm so smart, I'm not really gonna like pay attention to the things I'm not good at, and keep, living this sort of crazy kind of lie almost, which is very depressing, or hating themselves, getting really depressed. The kids do much better if they know how their brain works.
And I would imagine it can become very difficult to unravel that masking the longer it goes on.
Yeah, and as Sharon said, that narrative that you've had about that kid has had to hear over and over again about themselves, it's really hard to undo that. So we just try to be really specific about, you're great at this, you're not so great at this, but we're not all great at everything.
Right. And it's about, when we're building a profile, at least in my experience in schools, we're talking about, here are strengths and then here are relative weaknesses, right? And so even a student who has, let's say, exceptional strengths, and then something comes out at average for them, that's a relative weakness, even though it's average, right? And we all have that. And I think for students to know, that there is something that can be done about it. We don't want them to be victims. We don't want them to walk around saying, I have ADHD and therefore my executive function skills are terrible. Don't look at me, right? No, there are things that can be done and practice, and there can be expectations, even if a student's really struggling. But we need to, again, set them up for success, right? We need to take the baby steps with them.
Yeah. And the validation that these things, are hard. And that's not just what they're feeling. It's true. It's okay. Another question I see here. How do parents know, or how do they understand if a child is really having some of these types of struggles? How do they know if they're going to just grow out of it, give it a little more time? They'll get better with some age. How do parents know when to stop that and say, we do need help. We need to look outside and we need to get some strategies here? What would be that breaking point?
The breaking point, in my opinion, is when life becomes really tough. When you as a parent really say, you know what, this is just not working.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's intuitive. And often what I hear when parents come in my door, and this has been going on for years, right, was that the intuition was there, but somehow there was this sort of like, well, let's just wait and see, maybe, right, maybe this, maybe that, or my kid's not so keen on, going to somebody to talk about this, and I don't want to drag them there, right? So there are many reasons why there can be a delay, but we as parents know our kids better than anyone. We just know. We have a sense of like, this is just not, life is getting too difficult here, right? And it shouldn't be this way.
Yeah.
I also, as a clinical psychologist, it's like their concerns, your child's concerns will show up somewhere. Sometimes it's, in their body. They have tummy aches before going to bed. They have headaches. They're avoiding certain tasks. Your child will tell you, and I think your intuition and your gut will tell you. And it's never too early to ask someone, ask a professional, speak to this class. Speak to the teacher. There aren't very many stigmas, hopefully, anymore, I hope.
Thank you. I think that is probably a good point to wrap up with. I think we've answered most of the questions that have come in, and you covered so much. So thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming tonight. And as a reminder, this event has been recorded and is available at the Heard and Rye website, www.heardandrye.com. We've also included on the website a parent and child resource guide by age group provided by Dr. Hilary Cooper. And we also included Sharon Thomas's executive function skills guide on our website as well. So you can also check the chat section, which also has the relevant links. We look forward to seeing you all at our next event, which is on October 21st. And we are excited to be welcoming Claire Lerner, who will be presenting on the topic of understanding and supporting highly sensitive children. Thank you again, and have a great evening. We hope to see you soon.